I sat in the conference room watching my career get stolen in real time. Javed Langston, my boss, stood at the front of the room presenting our team's 6-month project to the board and clients. Every slide, every insight, every breakthrough. We had worked nights and weekends to create it all. But as Javed clicked through the presentation, he used words like my vision, my strategy, and my innovative approach. Not once did he mention my name or any of my team members. The clients nodded approvingly, completely captivated by Javed's confident delivery. "This is exactly the kind of forward-thinking leadership we need," one client said. My colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, shooting me concerned glances. I kept my face neutral, professional, but inside I felt like I was watching a car crash in slow motion. 9 years I'd been with this company, and this was how my work got presented, as someone else's genius. Javed concluded with a smile, soaking up the applause that should have been ours. That moment, sitting in that sterile conference room, something fundamental shifted inside me. I had always believed that good work speaks for itself. I was about to learn how wrong I was. Back at my desk, I tried to hold my composure, but my hands were shaking slightly as I opened my laptop. The team gathered around me quietly, their faces a mix of anger and disbelief. "Hassan, are you okay?" whispered Maya, one of our junior analysts. I managed a smile, but I could feel my eyes betraying the heartbreak I was trying to hide. "I'm fine," I said, though we all knew it wasn't true. "That was our work up there," muttered Carlos, another team member. 6 months of our lives, and he didn't mention us once. I nodded silently, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The worst part wasn't just the theft of credit, it was the casual way Javed had done it, like our contributions were so insignificant they didn't even warrant a footnote. For 9 years, I had been the quiet backbone of this department, the one who solved problems behind the scenes, who mentored young employees, who stayed late to make sure projects succeeded. But apparently, none of that mattered when it was time for recognition. I closed my laptop and told my team to go home early. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering when being principled had become such a disadvantage. A week later, the announcement came via company-wide email. Javed Langston had been promoted to Vice President of Strategic Development. I stared at the screen in my cubicle, reading the glowing description of his innovative leadership and groundbreaking project management. My own performance review had been scheduled for the same week, and I had foolishly hoped it might lead somewhere. Instead, HR's message was clear. "You're incredibly valuable to us, Hassan, but Javed has that visionary quality we need in leadership." The irony was suffocating. The entire leadership team genuinely believed Javed had created our work. Nobody had bothered to fact-check his claims or ask about the actual contributors. I realized then that perception had become more important than reality in corporate America. Javed's confident presentations and networking skills had convinced everyone that he was the mastermind, while I remained the invisible workhorse in the background. My colleagues were just as shocked as I was. "This is insane," Maya said during lunch. "Everyone knows you led that project." But knowing and proving are two different things, and Javed had masterfully erased our fingerprints from months of hard work. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to fight this battle with emotion. I was going to fight it with facts. The changes started immediately after Javed's promotion. Suddenly, I found myself excluded from meetings I had previously led. Javed began inviting junior staff members to executive briefings instead of me, apparently to showcase his mentoring abilities. The most insulting moment came when I discovered my name had been quietly removed from a major client email thread, the same thread where I'd been the primary point of contact for 8 months. When I asked Javed about it, he shrugged casually. "I thought it would be cleaner to have one primary contact moving forward," he said, not even looking up from his computer. "Nothing personal, Hassan. But everything about this felt personal." I watched as he systematically erased my contributions from ongoing projects, repositioning himself as the originator of ideas I had developed months earlier. My team members started coming to me privately, expressing their frustration with Javed's new management style. "He's taking credit for everything we do," Carlos whispered during a coffee break. "And he's making us look incompetent in front of the other departments." I listened to their complaints with growing anger, but I kept my responses measured and professional. Javed might have the upper hand now, but every act of injustice was creating a paper trail. I just needed to be patient enough to let him hang himself with his own rope. The final insult came during the Friday town hall meeting. As Javid droned on about team collaboration and shared success, he announced the monthly recognition awards. My name was called for something called the Team Spirit Award, a vague acknowledgement that came with a digital badge and absolutely no bonus or meaningful recognition. I walked to the front of the room, smiled politely, and shook Javid's hand, while the audience gave lukewarm applause. Hassan embodies the collaborative spirit we value here, Javid said into the microphone, as if he was doing me some great favor. The award was clearly designed to make it look like I was being recognized while actually minimizing my contributions. It was a participation trophy for adults, and everyone in the room knew it. As I returned to my seat, I caught the sympathetic looks from colleagues who understood exactly what had just happened. The Team Spirit Award was corporate speak for, "We know you do good work, but we're not going to reward it meaningfully." That night, I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before driving home, letting the full weight of the humiliation sink in. Javid had found the perfect way to acknowledge my existence, while simultaneously making it clear that I would never be considered leadership material. The storm inside me was no longer growing, it was ready to break. I stayed late at the office that evening, waiting until the building was nearly empty. In the quiet break room, I spread my prayer mat toward Mecca and performed Maghrib prayer, finding solace in the familiar ritual. After completing the prayer, I raised my hands for dua, speaking softly in the empty room. Ya Allah, show me how to deal with those who act with injustice. Give me wisdom and patience to handle this situation in a way that honors you and serves truth. I leave this in your hands, but grant me the strength to do what is right. The prayer calmed my racing heart and cleared my mind. I had been raised to believe that Allah tests us through difficulties, and that our response to injustice reveals our true character. Revenge was not the Islamic way, but neither was accepting oppression silently. There had to be a path between those extremes, a way to stand up for truth without compromising my principles. As I folded my prayer mat, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in weeks. The answer wasn't to fight Javid emotionally, or to match his underhanded tactics. The answer was to let truth speak for itself, but to make sure truth had a voice loud enough to be heard. I was no longer angry, I was focused. While cleaning up my desk the next morning, my hand brushed against the small, portable USB drive I kept in my drawer. Suddenly, I remembered. This drive contained backup files from our major project, including original drafts, time-stamped documents, and email chains showing the real development process. I had created the backup months ago as a precaution, never imagining I'd need it to prove my own contributions to my own work. With trembling fingers, I plugged the USB into my computer and opened the files. There it was, 6 months of documented evidence showing every stage of the project's development. The original brainstorming documents had my name and Maya's name all over them. The initial client emails came from my account. The breakthrough algorithm that Javid now claimed as his innovative vision was clearly attributed to Carlos in the development notes. I scrolled through file after file, each one time-stamped and documented, creating an irrefutable timeline of who actually created what. Javid had been so confident in his theft that he hadn't bothered to cover his tracks properly. The digital evidence was overwhelming, but I knew I had to be strategic about how to use it. Simply confronting Javid wouldn't work. He'd find a way to discredit me or claim the evidence was fabricated. I needed a plan that would let the truth speak for itself in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. I met my old mentor, Kareem, at our usual coffee shop downtown. Kareem was a retired operations director who had taught me everything I knew about corporate strategy during my early years at the company. His salt and pepper beard and wise eyes made him look like the father figure I had always needed in my professional life. I explained the situation carefully, showing him some of the evidence on my laptop. Kareem listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Hassan," he finally said, "if you expose Javid emotionally, they'll dismiss you as a disgruntled employee. If you attack him publicly, you'll look petty and vindictive. You have to dismantle him professionally, quietly, strategically." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Let him destroy himself with his own lies. Your job is just to make sure the right people see the truth when the time comes." Kareem sketched out a rough strategy on a napkin. Document everything, build alliances carefully, wait for the right moment to present evidence to people who mattered. Patience is your greatest weapon, he said. Javed's arrogance will eventually create the perfect opportunity. Be ready when it comes. I folded the napkin and put it in my pocket, feeling like I finally had a roadmap forward. I called my plan Operation Sabre, Sabre being the Arabic word for patience. Every day, I methodically documented Javed's false claims and compiled evidence of our team's real contributions. I created detailed timelines showing when each idea was originally proposed, by whom, and how Javed had later repackaged those ideas as his own innovations. I saved screenshots of Slack conversations, printed email threads, and backed up internal wiki pages that showed the true development process. The evidence was overwhelming, but I organized it carefully, making sure every claim could be verified independently. I also started paying closer attention to Javed's patterns of behavior. He had a tendency to claim credit not just for our team's work, but for contributions from other departments as well. The more I investigated, the more I realized that Javed's entire reputation was built on stolen intellectual property from hardworking employees he had systematically marginalized. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about a pattern of exploitation that had gone unchecked for too long. I kept my research private, sharing it with no one. But I could feel my confidence growing with each piece of evidence I collected. The truth was on my side. I just needed to be patient enough to let Javed's lies catch up with him. Two of our junior analysts, Maya and Omar, approached me privately during lunch break. They had been growing increasingly frustrated with Javed's management style and his habit of taking credit for their contributions. Hassan, Maya said quietly, we know what Javed did to you in that presentation. It's not right. Omar nodded in agreement. He yelled at me privately last week for questioning one of his ideas, an idea that was actually mine from 3 months ago. They offered to help expose Javed's pattern of credit theft, not out of revenge, but because they genuinely wanted truth to prevail. I was careful not to ask them to do anything unethical or risky to their own careers. Instead, I simply asked them to document their own interactions with Javed and to save any evidence of their original contributions being misattributed. We're not trying to destroy anyone, I emphasized. We're just trying to make sure the truth is available when people start asking questions. Maya and Omar understood perfectly. They had both been raised with strong ethical values, and they recognized that staying silent about Javed's behavior was essentially enabling it to continue. Having allies made me feel less isolated, but it also increased my sense of responsibility. This was no longer just about my own vindication. It was about protecting other hardworking employees from being exploited by an unethical manager. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A senior client from the original presentation, Mrs. Patterson, reached out to me directly via email. Hassan, she wrote, I was reviewing our project files and noticed some discrepancies. I thought you led the feature update we discussed last quarter. Her message was polite but pointed. She had clearly noticed that Javed's presentation didn't match her previous interactions with our team. I responded carefully, maintaining complete professionalism while offering to clarify any confusion. Mrs. Patterson, I'd be happy to walk you through the project history if that would be helpful. Would you be open to a private meeting to review the development timeline? She agreed immediately, asking if we could meet the following week. This was exactly the opportunity Kareem had told me to wait for. A chance to present facts to someone who had direct influence and who was asking for clarification, rather than me appearing to volunteer accusations. I spent the weekend preparing a clean, factual presentation that would show the true development process without appearing vindictive or emotional. The evidence would speak for itself, and Mrs. Patterson would draw her own conclusions about what had really happened. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope stirring in my chest. Truth was finally going to have its day in court. The meeting with Mrs. Patterson was held in a neutral conference room at her company's offices. I brought only factual materials, timestamp documents, email threads, development logs, and project files that clearly showed the real timeline of our work. I was careful to present everything objectively, without editorializing or making accusations against Javed. I never needed recognition for its own sake, I explained. But I can't allow lies to stand anymore, especially when they're affecting our ability to serve clients effectively. Mrs. Patterson reviewed each document carefully, cross-referencing dates and comparing the materials to her own records of our interactions. As the evidence mounted, her expression grew increasingly serious. Hassan, this timeline shows that you were the primary point of contact for the first 5 months of this project. But Javed's presentation made it sound like he conceived and managed everything personally. I nodded, letting the facts speak for themselves. "I understand this puts you in a difficult position," I said, "but I thought you deserved to know the accurate history of the work you're paying for." By the end of the meeting, Mrs. Patterson's face had gone pale. She thanked me for my honesty and said she would need to review her company's relationship with our firm. As I left her office, I knew that the wheels of justice were finally beginning to turn. 3 days later, Mrs. Patterson contacted our company's CEO directly. I didn't hear about the call immediately, but I could sense something shifting in the office atmosphere. There were more closed-door meetings, more whispered conversations between executives, and a general tension that hadn't been there before. Javed seemed unaware of the brewing storm, continuing his usual pattern of taking credit for other people's work and excluding team members from important discussions. But I noticed that some of the senior leadership had started asking more detailed questions about project histories and team contributions. The CEO had apparently told Mrs. Patterson that he would look into the matter personally, which meant someone was about to start asking uncomfortable questions about Javed's claims. I maintained my normal routine, continuing to do excellent work while quietly documenting everything. The beauty of letting Mrs. Patterson raise the concerns was that it removed any appearance of me being a disgruntled employee making unfounded accusations. Instead, this was now a client questioning the accuracy of information they had been given, which made it a legitimate business concern that had to be investigated thoroughly. I could feel the tide beginning to turn, but I knew better than to celebrate prematurely. The real test would be whether our leadership had the integrity to acknowledge uncomfortable truths when they emerged. Within a week of Mrs. Patterson's call, a routine audit was announced for Javed's past projects. The email from corporate described it as a standard review process, but everyone in the department could sense that this was anything but routine. Auditors began requesting detailed documentation about project timelines, team assignments, and contribution histories. They interviewed team members individually, asking specific questions about who had originated various ideas and who had been responsible for different aspects of implementation. I answered all questions honestly and provided any documentation they requested, but I was careful not to appear eager to incriminate Javed. The auditors were thorough, cross-referencing multiple sources and building comprehensive timelines for each project. What they discovered confirmed everything I had documented privately. Javed had systematically claimed credit for other people's work across multiple projects and teams. The pattern was so consistent that it couldn't be explained as simple misunderstanding or miscommunication. As word of the audit spread through the office, I noticed that some of Javed's previous victims began coming forward with their own stories. People who had been too intimidated to speak up individually found courage in numbers. The audit was turning into something much larger than anyone had initially anticipated, a comprehensive review of Javed's entire tenure as a manager. Javed's behavior began to change dramatically as the audit continued. He became paranoid, defensive, and increasingly aggressive toward team members. One afternoon, he stormed into my office with his face red with anger. "Did you go behind my back to the clients?" he demanded, standing too close to my desk in what felt like an intimidation tactic. I remained calm, keeping my voice level and professional. "No, Javed. I've just been doing my job, same as always." He slammed his hand on my desk, causing my coffee mug to rattle. "Don't lie to me, Hassan. Someone's been spreading lies about my work, and I know it's you." I looked him directly in the eyes, feeling strangely peaceful despite his aggression. "I haven't spread any lies about anyone's work. I've only shared facts when specifically asked." Javed's face grew even redder. "You're trying to sabotage my career because you're jealous of my promotion." I almost laughed at the irony. "Javed, I'm not trying to sabotage anyone. The truth doesn't need my help. It speaks for itself." He stormed out of my office, slamming the door hard enough to make my colleagues look up from their desks. For the first time in weeks, I found myself smiling slightly. Javed's panic was proof that the audit was finding exactly what I knew it would find. His house of cards was finally beginning to collapse. The next phase of Javed's downfall came in the form of an accidentally leaked email chain. Someone, though no one could prove who, had forwarded internal communications to the board that showed Javed systematically manipulating project timelines, excluding team members from meetings, and deleting their names from reports before presenting to clients. The emails painted a devastating picture of calculated credit theft and team exploitation. The leak appeared to come from multiple sources, making it impossible to trace back to any single whistleblower. I had certainly contributed some of the documentation, but I wasn't the only one who had grown tired of Javed's behavior. Maya and Omar had access to their own email threads, and other team members from different departments had apparently saved communications showing similar patterns of abuse. The beautiful thing about the leak was that it consisted entirely of Javed's own words and actions. These weren't accusations or interpretations. They were Javed's actual emails showing him claiming credit for other people's work and intentionally marginalizing productive team members. The board couldn't dismiss this as gossip or hearsay because it was all documented in the company's own communication systems. Javed tried to claim that the emails had been taken out of context or selectively edited, but the timestamps and complete thread histories made his denials impossible to sustain. The evidence was overwhelming, and it had come directly from Javed's own digital footprint. As the audit intensified and Javed's position became increasingly precarious, I made a decision that surprised even me. I quietly began applying to positions outside the company, specifically targeting a nonprofit think tank that focused on workplace ethics and organizational justice. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Javed was fighting to salvage his stolen reputation, I was preparing to leave voluntarily to pursue work that actually aligned with my values. The think tank responded to my application within 24 hours, expressing strong interest in my background and requesting an immediate interview. During our conversation, I was honest about my current situation without going into inappropriate detail. I'm looking for an environment where integrity is valued as much as results, I explained. I want to use my skills to help organizations build more ethical and sustainable practices. They were impressed by my experience and offered me a position on the spot. The salary was slightly lower than my current job, but the work was meaningful and the organizational culture was exactly what I had been seeking. I realized that this whole ordeal with Javed had clarified something important for me. I didn't want to spend my career fighting against toxic behavior. I wanted to spend it building something better. It was time to leave this environment on my own terms. Before the situation became any messier or more personal, I submitted my resignation letter on a Tuesday morning, walking into HR with a simple, professionally written document that gave 2 weeks' notice. The HR director, Monica, looked genuinely shocked as she read the letter. "Hassan, you've been with us for 9 years. This is completely unexpected." I maintained my composure, explaining that I had found an opportunity that better aligned with my career goals. Monica immediately began discussing counteroffers and retention packages, clearly panicked about losing someone they had always considered a reliable foundation of the company. "We can match any salary offer," she insisted. "We can discuss promotion opportunities, expanded responsibilities, whatever you need." I politely declined each offer, explaining that my decision wasn't primarily financial. "I just want peace," I said simply. "I want to work in an environment where good work is recognized honestly, and where team members support each other rather than compete destructively." Monica pressed for more specific reasons, clearly sensing that my departure was connected to the ongoing audit situation. But I kept my responses diplomatic and professional, refusing to turn my exit interview into an opportunity to air grievances. My resignation would speak loudly enough on its own. When a 9-year veteran quietly walks away during a leadership crisis, it sends a message about the organization's culture that no amount of spin can counter. The CEO called me personally within hours of my resignation hitting his desk. "Hassan," his voice was serious but respectful, "I need to ask you directly. Is it true that Javed took credit for your team's work?" This was the moment I had been waiting for, but I was careful to handle it with the same professionalism I had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "Sir, I think the truth is already coming out through the audit process," I replied. "I don't need to add my personal grievances to that investigation. I just pray that the right lessons are learned from whatever is discovered." The CEO was quiet for a moment, clearly processing my response. "Hassan, I want you to know that if Javed has been misrepresenting other people's contributions, there will be serious consequences. But I also want to understand why we're losing someone of your caliber right now." I chose my words carefully. I've always believed that good organizations eventually correct themselves when problems are identified. My leaving isn't about punishment or protest. It's about finding a place where I can do my best work without worrying about who gets credit for it. By the end of the call, the CEO had a clear understanding that my departure was directly related to leadership issues, but that I wasn't going to be drawn into making specific accusations. My resignation was my statement, and it was speaking volumes about the current state of the organization's culture. The internal audit report was completed and distributed 3 weeks after I submitted my resignation. Though I was no longer an employee, Maya shared the key findings with me during a coffee meeting. Javed had been formally cited for misrepresentation of team contributions, unethical leadership practices, and systematic exploitation of subordinate staff members. The report documented at least 7 major projects where Javed had claimed credit for other people's work, affecting more than a dozen employees across multiple departments. His recent promotion to vice president was immediately suspended pending further investigation. More importantly, the report recommended significant changes to how project contributions were documented and how leadership performance was evaluated. The company was implementing new systems to ensure that individual contributions were tracked and recognized appropriately. Javed's response to the report was predictably defensive. He claimed that he was being scapegoated for broader organizational problems and that his accusers were motivated by jealousy and resentment. But the evidence was too comprehensive and the pattern too clear for his denials to carry any weight. Several board members who had initially supported his promotion were now distancing themselves from him. The same presentation skills and confidence that had helped Javed steal credit were now working against him, making him appear arrogant and dishonest when faced with documented evidence of his misconduct. During my final week at the company, I gave a brief farewell speech to the assembled staff. I had carefully prepared remarks that would be memorable without being vindictive or unprofessional. I've learned a lot during my 9 years here, I began, but the most important lesson is that leadership isn't about ego or personal advancement. Real leadership is about responsibility to your team, to your clients, and to the truth. I paused, making eye contact with several colleagues who had supported me throughout the ordeal. You don't build greatness by stealing sunlight from those who helped you grow. You build it by creating an environment where everyone can shine. The room was completely silent as I concluded. I'm grateful for the relationships I've built here, and I hope this organization continues to learn and grow in ways that honor the good people who make it successful. The response was overwhelming. Colleagues who had never spoken to me personally came forward to shake my hand and express their respect for how I had handled the situation. Even some of Javed's former allies acknowledged that my departure was a significant loss for the company. Javed himself was notably absent from the gathering, apparently unwilling to face the colleague he had wronged so systematically. My speech became legendary in the office, with people referring to it months later as an example of how to maintain dignity under pressure while still standing up for principles. The isolation that followed Javed's exposure was swift and decisive. Within weeks of the audit report's release, Javed became toxic within the organization. Colleagues who had previously sought his approval now avoided him entirely. He was excluded from strategic planning meetings and removed from client-facing responsibilities. Junior staff members stopped asking him for guidance, and senior leadership began routing important decisions around him entirely. I heard through former colleagues that Javed's office had become a lonely island in an otherwise collaborative environment. His attempts to rebuild relationships were met with polite but distant responses from people who no longer trusted his motives or his honesty. The promotion he had stolen through lies had become a prison of professional isolation. Maya told me that Javed had started eating lunch alone and leaving the office early most days, apparently unable to cope with the social consequences of his actions. The final blow came when the company announced a reorganization that resulted in Javed being reassigned to a lower-level position with no direct reports and limited responsibilities. He was essentially being managed out of the organization, allowed to resign quietly rather than being terminated publicly. It was a face-saving measure for the company, but it represented a complete fall from grace for someone who had been seen as a rising star just months earlier. 6 months after leaving the company, I received a handwritten email from the CEO that I will never forget. Hassan, it read, I've had time to reflect on everything that happened during your final months with us. I want you to know that I seriously underestimated your character and your contributions to our organization. More importantly, I failed to create an environment where your integrity was properly valued and protected. The email continued with specific changes the company had implemented based on lessons learned from the Javed situation. Your quiet dignity throughout that entire ordeal reminded us what real leadership looks like. I hope you're finding the success you deserve in your new role. I was touched by the CEO's willingness to admit organizational failures and to acknowledge that my departure had been a loss for the company. It validated my decision to handle the situation with patience and professionalism rather than anger and accusations. The email also included news that Javed had officially resigned, and that several other employees who had been marginalized under his leadership were now thriving in new roles with proper recognition for their contributions. The organizational culture was apparently improving significantly, with new policies in place to prevent future incidents of credit theft and team exploitation. Reading that email, I felt a deep sense of closure and satisfaction, not because Javed had been punished, but because positive changes had emerged from a difficult situation. My new position at the nonprofit think tank exceeded every expectation I had held. The work was meaningful, focused on helping organizations build more ethical and sustainable practices. My colleagues were genuinely collaborative, sharing credit freely and supporting each other's professional growth. The environment was everything I had hoped for when I left my previous job. One afternoon, while reviewing applications for our fellowship program, I heard a familiar voice in the hallway. Maya had also left the consulting firm and had applied for a research position with our organization. During her interview, she told me privately, "I followed your lead, Hassan. After watching how you handled everything with Javed, I realized I wanted to work somewhere that shared my values." Over the following months, Omar and 2 other former colleagues also joined our organization or connected organizations in our network. We had essentially created our own professional community based on shared principles rather than corporate politics. The think tank's director told me that our team had quickly gained a reputation for producing high-quality research and maintaining exceptional professional standards. "You've brought a culture of integrity that's influencing our entire organization," she said. It was the kind of recognition that actually meant something, acknowledgement of character and values rather than just technical skills or political positioning. About a year after leaving the consulting firm, I received an unexpected email from Javed. The subject line read "Character Reference Request," and the message asked if I would be willing to provide a professional recommendation for a position he was seeking. I stared at the email for several minutes, considering how to respond. The man who had stolen my work, marginalized my contributions, and tried to destroy my reputation was now asking for my help in rebuilding his career. There was a certain poetic justice in the moment. Javed's fall had been so complete that he was now reaching out to one of his victims for assistance. I thought about everything that had happened, about the pain and frustration of watching my work get stolen, about the long nights spent documenting evidence and waiting for truth to emerge.
Then I thought about the Islamic principles that had guided me throughout the ordeal. The importance of forgiveness, the danger of revenge, the value of taking the high road even when it's difficult. In the end, I simply deleted the email without responding. I didn't need to help Javed rebuild his career, but I also didn't need to actively hinder his efforts to start over. I returned to writing a report about ethical leadership practices, drawing on lessons learned from my own experience with workplace injustice. My victory wasn't in Javed's defeat. It was in building something better for myself and others who valued integrity over advancement. Some battles are won not through revenge, but through the simple act of refusing to let other people's failures define your own success.